A Bit Lit, celebrating research and creativity of all kinds.
Connor, hello, how are you?
Yeah, I'm not too bad, Andy. Thanks so much for having me on.
We're delighted to have you, absolutely thrilled to have you. We start our films by asking contributors to introduce themselves and to tell us a little bit about their work. So would you mind doing that, please?
Yes, perfect. So my name is Conor Heffernan, and I'm currently Assistant Professor of Physical Culture and Sports Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. That is actually, surprisingly, the shortest that I can put that title. I'm very aware that it has a touch of the Game of Thrones about it, Slayer of Dragons, Destroyer of Worlds. When I'm not destroying worlds or, slaying dragons, I study the history of physical activity, fitness, bodybuilding, keep fit exercise in the 1800s and 1900s. So looking at how people started to go to the gym, what they wanted to get from going to the gym, and how gym cultures influenced education, military training, medicine, and more competitive forms of sport. So that's the elevator pitch. When I teach it to students, I just say, I study the desire to look better naked in different societies. So I'm either the highfalutin individual who looks at fitness's intersection with other activities, or the individual in the trench coat who's wondering why people want to look better naked. So depending on the pathway you want to go down, that's how I describe myself.
There's a lot there. Okay, I'm having a think about where to go first. We're thinking historically in terms of a period of empire, and I guess we might want to think about sport and its confluence with competitive sport and its confluence with empire then. You've introduced at the end the concept of kind of nude hotness, which we must definitely come back to. And you use the phrase the gym in conjunction with the 18th and 19th centuries. I guess I'll start there in a way. Like, would an 18th century person say, hey, bro, let's go to the gym? Is that a thing that they would say?
I mean, not in as many words. They would say probably the gymnasium, which doesn't have the same bro connotations. But there was this expansion of the gymnasium in the early 1800s. Obviously, though, it wasn't as accessible as it would be. Oh, sorry, gyms have been closed with COVID now for about a year and a half. In 2018, as accessible as the gyms would have been 3 years ago. So initially, it was either something you did if you were elite or wealthy, bored, worried that modernity was going to depress your life into this little ball of physical and mental sluggishness, or you were a soldier, a recruit, where you were trained before they shipped you off to one of the many ports of empire. So gymnasium cultures initially could be found at the very high end, at the more kind of low institutional end, and then there was a gap in between. And in the 1800s, 1900s, you start to see the gap closing, where more and more people, whether they want to or not, are being introduced to gym cultures and gym activities.
Great, thank you. That's a really interesting kind of two categories of people who would be doing this. I presume should we also add prisoners, the criminalised, to that list?
Yes, so there is a wonderful, especially distinctly Victorian idea of using physical activities to break down a prisoner, and then that you can build them back up. So one of my fun facts for students at the start of the semester is talking about how the treadmill really gains popularity in Victorian prisons in the mid 1800s, based on this idea of if we can just get people doing monotonous exercise for hours and hours and hours and hours, we'll physically break them down, mentally break them down, and then we can build them back up. It's part of this idea of reforming, the mind by reforming the body, and it'll come in different ways, and it still exists today in modern culture. We probably valorize it or glamorize it a little bit more with these prison workouts that people talk about. But it is there as well in Victorian prisons, and it is based on the idea of kind of an aesthetic, whipping yourself and punishing yourself to reform the soul. It's just put them on the treadmill for no purpose whatsoever, except for tiring them out, and then we can hopefully build them back up.
Yeah. Thank you. And I'm still thinking about kind of categories of people here. So we've got the elite and the wealthy, soldiers, and criminals. You use the word Victorian. So are you thinking in your research specifically about a British culture here, or more internationally?
So initially, a lot of my research interest was British and Irish. So looking at Great Britain, England, Scotland, Wales, and then also looking at Ireland in the 1800s, 1900s. The project that I'm working on at the moment, hopefully, is looking at it more in a global sense, because I'm going to be looking at how distinctly Indian exercise practices were brought to England in particular, were kind of repackaged, reformulated, and then were popularized in the United States. So looking at how these global ideas around the body and around fitness really started to solidify in the 1800s and 1900s.
Yeah.
And more than that, how the same practices could be seen in different countries. Because before that, you know, what they did in France was different to what they did in Italy, was different to what they did in Germany, but you start to see it all kind of homogenizing and becoming the same during the 1800s.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And then my kind of final category question is, are we thinking predominantly about men here? Is this a gendered activity or not?
So this is a highly gendered activity with the caveat or the little asterisk that says there was also female gym cultures or women's physical culture or physical activity during this period. It was just much more restricted, insulting, problematic than male physical culture or physical activity. So there is a fitness writer in the 1830s, Donald Walker, who writes a book for men called British Manly Exercise, which is, you know, the clickbait of the 1830s. You know, one of the century's most popular books. It goes through dozens of reeditions and republications. The same individual writes a book for women, and it's, you know, exercises for ladies designed to improve and enhance their beauty. And that kind of sums up quite neatly the distinction between men's and women's physical activity and physical culture. So it's primarily a male phenomenon, but there is still a space for women's physical activity or physical culture, with the proviso that for men, having a better body will open up your sexual or social world. For women, it's kind of the tired rhetoric of better mother, better wife. You know, they won't get brain fatigue from physical activity. They'll reform the delicate or gentle female body. I'm doing air quotes when I do a lot of these things. That's obviously not an audio medium, but I just can't help myself. So yeah, predominantly male, but there are female cultures within that space.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I almost wonder as well if the discourse around female exercise is sort of enabling you to say things about exercise that can't be said about male exercise around beauty and aestheticism, sort of unlocking, you know, so much of what you've told us in terms of the rationale for soldiers or the elite or criminals to exercise is about utility, its utility value. And I wonder if some of the discourse around female beauty also tells us what might really be going on or also going on when it comes to talking about male exercise.
Yeah, and I think you see a lot of rhetoric about the aesthetics of the male body in contrast and compared to Greco-Roman statuary or Greco-Roman ideals. So the spread of gym cultures also gives people in the kind of general public a vernacular or a language to evaluate male beauty in a way that hadn't really been done before. And not only male beauty from the face up, it's male beauty from the face down. And to do so in a, again, I'm going to say quote unquote, rather than doing air quotes, in a respectable way. So by the end of the 1800s, you know, a music hall performer can strip down to his loincloth or his posing trunks and be celebrated for it. There is no suspicion surrounding that activity because people are used to this idea of evaluating male muscularity in respectable terms.
I'm going to sit with that idea for a moment and get back to you on it. But that's fascinating. Yeah, so that the conjunction of respectability and muscle admiration. Have I got that right?
Yeah, I think that's probably the closest thing that I'm trying to say. I think as I said it out loud, I'm like, well, that's strange, even though I've studied this for many years.
I mean, you know, I'm used to 18th and 19th century people being weird. This feels like
it's nothing new.
On a par. And obviously the word gymnasium itself, I mean, you just talked about Greco-Roman culture. The word gymnasium is deliberately referring back to ancient Greek culture, or at least ancient Greek culture as understood in the Enlightenment. I mean, so I'm an early modernist. I'm thinking about this from my perspective of thinking about 16th century sporting and gaming, where the world of gaming in the sense of fairly non-physical practices like card playing or going to the theatre, they feel sort of on a continuum with sports in a way which at some point changes between then and now, and that we don't think of going to the theatre or playing a card game as the same thing as going to the gym. So I'm kind of wondering what the term gymnasium, which I think if I've understood you rightly, you're telling us it's kind of live in the 18th century, what that is unlocking for the people using that term. Am I right in thinking that does itself mean naked display?
Or a naked exercise or a naked display. So they're not doing that in the 1800s, unfortunately, because that would make for much better PowerPoint presentations in class. But it is this idea of capitalizing on the gravitas of ancient Greek and capitalizing on the gravitas of Greco and Roman history or Greco-Roman ideals to almost instantly legitimize your practice. Because you briefly touched upon, say, the Enlightenment. In the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, European physicians and European doctors start to take old Greco-Roman medical writings about the body and the need for physical training and say, this is something that we should do for health reasons. Then educators will come along and in quite radical texts say, we need to introduce gymnasium cultures into our schools based on a kind of healthy mind, healthy body aesthetic. In the 1800s, and definitely by the latter half of the century, when they're talking about the gymnasium, it is kind of unlocking this idea of holistic development of boys, of men, and then in an afterthought of women as well. So I think the power of that word, and not calling it something else, not calling it, the lifting emporium, which would sound so much better, is it's helping to legitimize it. It's a term that's been used by that time for several centuries, and it's, caught back up from the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. And it is this kind of catchword immediately of something, all-encompassing, something holistic. And there's no surprise that in the sporting realm, you get that healthy mind, healthy body ethos. And the gymnasium is probably the most heightened attempt to enact that in reality.
Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful. I'm also thinking that the 18th century, particularly the end of the 18th century, is the period of trying to field as large an army as you possibly can. And whether this is also connected to kind of the military might of individual nation states, that the healthy body isn't just a kind of pedagogical, educational desideratum, but it's something that you want if you're just going to field a lot of men to fight for the country.
Yeah, and there's a lot of evidence that in Britain in particular, but also in Germany, but in Britain, the Napoleonic Wars scare the living daylights out of military thinkers in Britain, because Napoleon's victories are in part predicated on these kind of young, fit, virile men who can quickly move around the field, before the opponents can kind of react. So in Britain, you start to see from the early 1800s, more and more emphasis on just drill and drilling and building up the cardiovascular health of troops. They don't use the term cardiovascular, but that's what they're referring to. And then by the 1820s, you get generals or adjunct generals to the forces like Henry Torrens who are saying, in conjunction with drill and marching and drill, we should also do some weighted exercises. So then they start to focus on strengthening bodies as well as kind of strengthening the ability to walk for long distances. In Germany, and in Prussia in particular, the Napoleonic Wars have been a slap in the face of Prussian masculinity. So Friedrich Jahn, who is a Prussian nationalist and early physical educationist, in the wake of the Napoleonic Wars, he creates his own system of gymnastics, explicitly saying that Prussian men need to be stronger because we have been embarrassed, emaciated, humiliated by our defeat to Napoleon. So he creates his Turner system of gymnastics, or Turnverein system of gymnastics, which will kind of spread from Prussia to Germany to mainland Europe to the United States. It's a global phenomenon, and it is rooted in military concerns, or at the very least, the influence of military concerns in Prussian gymnastic and military circles. So the late 18th century, and the kind of military war that is going on at that time encourages a much greater interest in physical activity. And this will actually be a pattern in the 1800s, the Crimean War, the Indian Uprising, even the Second South African War at the end of the century. All of these wars, these kind of big, large-scale conflicts, in the years after those conflicts are revisions to military training programs, specifically physical training programs, because they're saying we need to be fitter, we need to be stronger, we need to be healthier in the field. And obviously that's ironic, because as the century is progressing, guns and technology is becoming more and more important. But that ideology of fit, strong, virile troops, which is so rooted in the late 18th century, has a really long aftermath, I think, in the following decades.
Yeah, that's completely fascinating. Thank you so much. And Conor, your blog is really brilliant at talking about the history that you study in conjunction with the contemporary scene, the moment in which we're studying them and the moment in which we're thinking about them. And sometimes also talks about your own practice as someone interested in fitness and sport. Do you mind telling us a bit about that? So I guess firstly, what these sorts of histories tell us now about where we're at. And secondly, what it means to be someone researching this, but also doing some of this. You're not marching around Napoleonic battlefields, I presume, but nevertheless, you are embodying some of the things that you're also exploring, right?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely correct. So I suppose I'll maybe begin with the practice and then move into how previous iterations inform what we're doing today.
Thanks.
The study of physical culture, a lot of the people who study it have had some level of engagement with the activity themselves. People like who I work with, like Professor Jan Todd, was an elite powerlifter before she became an historian. Her late husband, Dr. Terry Todd, again, elite powerlifter before he became a historian. David Webster, who was one of the first people to collect materials, was a British strongman and music hall performer who then became an historian. John Fair is a weightlifter. I'm of that ilk, with the caveat and exception that I am not in any way elite or proficient or successful in my endeavors. So I've done 2 natural bodybuilding shows in the past. Both of them have reiterated that although my family survived the great famine of the 19th century, they did so with very poor genetics, and that is something that I will not be able to overcome no matter how hard I try. But I love and thoroughly enjoy going to the gym, exercising in a variety of forms, and kind of engaging in the modern iterations of what I study. And for me, that helps to inform the knowledge that I have of the late 1800s, early 1900s, because I have an innate knowledge of the exercises that they're doing, some of the motivations of why they're trying to do these things, and then also the aftermath or the influence or the effect that these practices would have on the body. So something that I'm fascinated in, but it's very difficult to do from a historical perspective, is look at the actual impact that exercise programs had on individual bodies. What happened to your body if you did an exercise program? Did you lose weight? Did you build muscle? If so, what muscles did you build? What can that tell us about what was privileged in that society? Obviously, it's very hard because they're all dead and muscle wastes, unfortunately. But that has given me an appreciation of how practice can inform research and vice versa. Switching gears and talking about, say, my blog, which looks at the history of fitness predominantly in the 1800s and early 1900s, a lot of what I'm trying to do there is kind of satisfy my innate curiosity in a public history setting rather than a professional setting, and looking at, well, where did these trends that are so popular now emerge from? Or where did these exercises emerge from? Or the machines that we use, or the diets that we adhere to, or the supplements that we take? What is the history of these things, and how did their early origins inform where we are now? So in much the same way that my own kind of gym practice informs my research interests and my knowledge within those interests, the blog, the website, is effectively me trying to satisfy my curiosity. And then thankfully I found that there are other strange individuals like me who also have the same questions. So it's a wonderful opportunity to engage within, say, my community of gym cultures and actually speak to things that people haven't thought about but are interested in.
Yeah, I'm furious to be called a strange individual, but I take your point. Yeah, that's fascinating. And there's a curious conjunction there, I think, in that much of the history that you're telling is, perhaps the word negative is wrong, but it's the history makes you question the relationship of these exercises to forms of masculinity, for example, which have been historically negative, and yet at the same time, I guess, as people that use the gym, we're also sort of signed up to the idea that there are, I mean, we wouldn't be doing it if we didn't think there were good things there as well. So I wonder what the tension is there.
There's a huge tension in studying fitness because it is an area that's born from personal and social anxiety. whether it's government saying there's an obesity epidemic, we need people to be fit and healthy, whether it's the military saying men are effeminate and not strong enough for battle, we need to do something, or whether it's an individual saying I don't like the way I look or I want to be stronger. There's a huge amount of personal and institutionalized projection onto the male or female body. And I think that creates a huge amount of tension where there are quite reductive ideas about masculinity and what is the ideal male body, or femininity, what's the ideal female body, or what is the healthy body, which is such a minefield even today when we look at, say, the tension that the fat acceptance movement or fat studies scholars encounter when they try and bring some of their ideas into the fitness community, and the pushback is often very horrific in many different ways. So there's a lot of negative components to gym cultures, but there is also that kind of personal embodiment, this empowerment, the enjoyment of, people who study sport would say the enjoyment of play, or the spontaneity of play. There is that euphoric feeling of exercising. There is an empowerment when it comes to physical activity or physical culture. So I think one is always dealing with the tension between the enjoyment that some derive from it, sometimes adhering to some of the more reductive identities within the space, but sometimes going off in a different direction. So when I work with students, something that I love doing is looking at elite female bodybuilders. Taken out of context, that clip sounds very creepy, but the reason why I enjoy looking at elite female bodybuilders is because this is a predominantly, a feminine space that is attacking or contrasting more general ideas about the ideal female body within the fitness culture. So you can actually have interviews with elite female bodybuilders where they're saying, this isn't what everyone thinks a woman's body should look like, but this is what I want my body to look like. And this is how I'm going to live with it. And people need to accept and respect that. It doesn't mean that everyone has to look like this, but it means that there has to be a space for me to operate in. And historically, even today, that hasn't really been the space. So you can look at how that negative elements of the fitness industry continue to kind of shape its contours, how people are working within or fighting against that. And it just means it's a great kind of confusing soup where there's no good or bad. It's all just kind of mixed in. And then the job is, when you're researching it, to try and hold both paths kind of hand in hand. And that's where a lot of the difficulty for me comes from, because obviously I'm someone who enjoys doing these things, was also cognizant of the problems inherent in a lot of these fields and the ideas within these fields. And trying to mark that balance is often quite difficult.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really brilliant answer and a really helpful way of thinking about it. I think too about the word fitness and the word fit and kind of the weird histories of those two words. And they're kind of the way they're saying things about how people do or don't belong somewhere. So if you're unfit, does that mean that you don't have fitness, or that you do not fit in the place where society wants to put you? And again, as a kind of 16th century person, that's the kind of live sense of that word in the 16th century. I don't think it has much to do with sport and much more to do with suitability of some kind. You are fit for a particular task. But then there's also that other meaning of the word fit, meaning to have some form of mental or physical involuntary convulsions, which are also live in the 16th century. I never quite know how those two words fit together, because I presume that they're strongly related. But yeah, it's a word which really unlocks questions about agency and helplessness, control of your body, lack of control of your body, and those questions as to whether you belong somewhere or not, whether you are fit for a particular place.
Yeah, and actually it's funny when I talk about this with others and I say, if you define fitness, it's really at its general term, the ability to do a certain task efficiently. If we're to use, say, a more modern understanding of it. So that could be running a race, going up a flight of stairs, lifting a heavy barbell, whatever you want to do. But there's this mercurial nature of it that means that everyone seems to have an idea of fitness within, say, gym cultures that differs from the next individual. Yeah. But they can all agree that to be unfit is negative or has an ill meaning. And I think some of the early writings on fitness in the early 1800s in particular are coming from medical fields. And it's interesting where they're looking at, say, like a biological fitness, and they're looking more at respiratory rate, heart function, etc. And because in that early period, there's a lot of bleeding over between gymnastic writers and medical writers, where you start to see the gymnastic cultures kind of co-opting this idea of fitness and applying it to their system. You know, my system will get you fitter, and kind of running with this idea of fitness as this all-encompassing good, but no one's really defining it. So I think how it kind of snakes into the fitness industry so neatly, and even the fact we're calling it fitness industry shows its power, is there is this kind of meshing together of medical and muscle communities in the 1800s, and it's not hierarchical because doctors are quoting gymnasts and they're saying, I was ignorant of this, but P.H. Clease's new exercise book I think could work really well in treating consumption, or Donald Walker's new exercise clubs, they can treat spinal deformities. So physicians and medical men are taking ideas from the gymnastic industry, the gymnastic writers are taking ideas from the medical industry, and I think fitness might be one of those things that crosses over quite well because it's not as popularized from what I've read in the 1700s in a gym community as it is within the 1800s.
Yeah, I mean, in that sense, it feels distinctively 18th century in that kind of taxonomic way of thinking about people and where they belong. It does feel like there's something quite distinctive going on there in terms of kind of conceptual shifts in ideas. I think this will be my final question now before I wrap the film up. But this is sort of taking me back to your earlier description of nude hotness, I guess. But you know, I made the enormous tactical error of being a teenager in the 1990s, and the word "fit" then meant hot, sexy, someone you would wish to have sex with. So it's still kind of bringing us back to that weird tension between, you just talked about fitness being efficient to do a particular task, and yet at the same time it also has this kind of much more sexual sense built into it. And you were saying, Conor, that kind of naked physical display was much more a product of the 19th century than of the 18th century. And my stupid brain heard you. You didn't say this, but in my stupid head, I was kind of hearing you say that they weren't really doing nudity in the 18th century at all. And I wanted to say, come on, someone must have been naked at some point in those 100 years. But yeah, how do I'm trying to pick out a question now from those ramblings, but can we kind of wrap the film up by thinking about just once more about that tension between fitness as utility and fitness as sexual desirability?
I think something that's quite interesting is to actually say, yeah, no one was ever naked in the 18th century. I mean, that's just a fact, Andy. And you can live with that or you can disprove me. But I think something that's quite interesting is there is a late 19th, early 20th century physical culturist, Eugen Sandow, who's seen for many as like the father of modern bodybuilding. And Sandow is a global star. He'll do muscle posing shows in Britain, India, South Africa, New Zealand, Australia, Ireland, and the United States. So he's known throughout the globe. Something that really helps Sandow's popularity is the photograph. So he's able to sell postcards of his images. He's able to market his images, put his image on posters of him in a singlet, him half naked, him recreating some Greco-Roman statue where he's just using a fig leaf. And throughout his career, he dies in 1925, either of a brain aneurysm or of syphilis, depending on who you want to speak to. He either died because he lifted a car out of a ditch and the force was so much that he had a brain hemorrhage, or he died of syphilis from being an alley cat. I know which one I would want my legacy to be. I'll leave that up to people to decide. But throughout his career,
why not both? Why not both? That's a false choice. Come on now.
you can have it all. Throughout his career, Sandow is showing off his physique, selling images of his physique. He appears in images or the films of Thomas Edison in the early 1900s with his physique, and he's saying this is an iteration of male beauty, and this is what everyone should aspire to. But he uses the term beauty. He never uses the term like sexuality or, this sexually attractive. It's always beauty in an objective, scientific sense. And you can see that because in the early 1900s, 1901, he hosts a physique competition in the Royal Albert Hall in London. And in the advertising for his physique show, he says there's going to be 120, amateur physical culturists coming to London, coming to the Royal Albert Hall. They're going to get up on plinths, they're going to pose their muscles, flex their muscles, and we are going to evaluate their bodies. He says no women are allowed in the auditorium because this is not about titillation. This is about scientific evaluation of male beauty. By the 1920s and 1930s, individuals and physical culturists start to really, play up the sexual component of their endeavors. So whereas Sandow in the early 1900s is saying, we do not do this for any sexual gratification or titillation whatsoever, even though his images are like trading quite nicely in the gay community in England during that time.
I was going to say, I'm like, sweetheart, that's the gayest thing I've ever heard. That's what
Oh, yeah, I mean, his poster, it's a trading card, like cigarettes in a POW camp. But, he himself and his agents are all saying this is male beauty. It's objectively, evaluating male beauty. By the 1920s, physical culturists start to say, what type of woman wants a weak man? You will be much more sexually attractive. You will have much greater vigor, quote unquote, if you take up my system of exercise. So in a 20-year period, we move from this is all just an objective study of beauty to this will help your sex life. It'll make you more sexually attractive, make you more sexually desirable. I think the shift in that is a combination of society has changed and also physical culturists are more adept at what will really bring more people in. Because it's been going on for 20 years, this physical culture movement by that period. What's the new hook that we can use? So in the 1920s and 30s, people start to sell mail order courses, M-A-I-L, not M-A-L-E, order courses, and they'll say this will improve your sexual vigor, sexual activity. Some of them will actually write books on sex, which are very, very utilitarian and weighted towards the men, unsurprisingly. And then from there, it kind of snowballs. So by the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, bodybuilding promoters like Joe Weider will be continually writing about sex. And he will actually criticize other entrepreneurs for being prudish because he's saying they're not talking about sex, but sex is such an important part of kind of the gym culture in and of itself. And he will start to market his bodybuilders like Arnold Schwarzenegger, like Frank Zane, like Sergio Olivier as kind of sex symbols in their own right. And a lot of the images and the rhetoric he's using has its origins in, say, the 1920s. Now, this is not to say that people weren't talking about sex in the 1900s in gym cultures. Bernard McFadden, who's an American bodybuilder, is writing about sex the whole time, but he is completely off the wall in terms of a lot of his ideas, so he's largely ignored. But the mainstream kind of folding in of fitness and sex begins in the 1920s and intensifies then after the 1950s. It takes a while, but then it starts to move into the open.
Fascinating. Thank you so much. Conor, we end our films by asking what the word literature means to you. Our project is called A Bit Lit, and we're kind of interested in the spaces around literature. And you're welcome to answer this as personally or as professionally as you like. You might also want to think about whether literature meant anything to some of the practitioners you've been talking about. You've been telling us quite a bit about particular books. British Manly Exercise is a title that will stay with me for a while, I think. So, but you might want to tell us what fitness literature is to you, for example. But yeah, what does the word literature mean to you?
Before this hit record, I said I would panically come up with an answer, and then I forgot all about this question. Well done, Conor, and COVID brain. For me, I suppose looking at fitness literature, it is an implicit attempt to sell a dream to people, because all of the fitness manuals, be it targeted at men, women, children, be it in a military context, an educational context, just a recreational context, is trying to sell people on a dream, on the idea that if you obtain this body, or if you can get your body to do this one thing or these several things, you will achieve insert message here. So for Eugene Sandow, if you can get your body to look like mine, you'll be more efficient. You could live to be 100. People will, praise your beauty. If you kick it forward 60 years, if you want to look like Arnold Schwarzenegger, people will admire you. You'll be masculine. You'll be attractive. You'll be successful. There is this innate promise within fitness literature that is half entertainment, but also half entrepreneurship. So I suppose for me, fitness literature is trying to subtly sell someone on a dream and make it think that it's their idea or their, message or identity that they need to take on.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Thank you. I mean, I'm fascinated by the way gender and possibly race haunt much of this conversation. One of the things that's really interesting about fitness discourse is it kind of gives the lie to cis gender identity as something stable. because fitness discourse spent its entire time saying this is how you can be more like a man or more like a woman. You can change your body to conform with particular cisgender stereotypes or ideals or whatever you want to call it. And I also wonder where race plays out in terms of, you're talking about the Royal Albert Hall displays in the early 20th century, for example, these kind of international gatherings and the ways in which various things intersect. I said I was wrapping the film up and I'm just opening up lots of cans of worms, but yeah, you're making me think about lots of really interesting intersections, which we probably shouldn't get into. If you have anything you'd like to say before we wrap up, do, because like I say, I've just opened a bunch of cans, but
yes, that's no problem. There's actually a wonderful book has just been published by Shannon Walsh on physical culture in antebellum America. And that's looking at the intersection between race, eugenics, and fitness within the United States. And Shannon makes a wonderful argument that if you look at the fitness literature in the US in the 1800s, so much of it is concerned with the ideal male and female body, but it's much more concerned with the ideal white body before anything else. And if you take, say, Shannon's work, which really is wonderful, on the 1800s, and you can look at someone like John Fair, who looks at bodybuilding history in America in the 1900s, and John Fair finds that, by the 1950s and 1960s, Black, African-American, Hispanic, Asian, and Latin bodybuilders are not winning bodybuilding shows, despite the fact that they are winning all of the individual awards. So you have iterations of someone winning the best arms, the best legs, the best back, the best abs, the best chest, which is pretty much, your head down, and still losing the competition or still losing the shows, because there's a tension between older judges of physiques who cannot conceptually give a Black or African-American bodybuilder like a Mr. America award, because the Mr. America competition, which is a famous bodybuilding show, is meant to be an encapsulation of American masculinity. And there is an implicit, sometimes explicit, feeling that, well, we know we said American masculinity, but we all know we meant white American masculinity. So there is a tension in the sport of bodybuilding in particular, because a lot of the ideas which have evolved for so many decades are about whiteness as well as masculinity and femininity. And you see the same things, and it's only starting to emerge now, play out in kind of cis bodybuilding or cis powerlifting debates. And something that I like to unpack with a lot of my students is there's a very famous powerlifter called Matt Kroc, who he's a cis male powerlifter. He transitioned, I want to say maybe 2008 or 2009, and the discourses and rhetoric about Matt Kroc, or I think it's Janet now, I can never remember, about Janet now, are so interesting how quickly they change, because he was a strong male powerlifter. He used to write, very inspirational messages about using the darkness and pain and anger to be a stronger man, etc. And once the transition took place from male to female, there is this huge backlash in powerlifting and bodybuilding communities, because there is this unease and this really great tension about what masculinity means, because he was this quote unquote masculine idol who has now transitioned, and from all accounts is much happier for doing so, and took a very brave decision given the kind of cultural milieu in which they were operating. But it is interesting that the tensions around cis male, cis female bodybuilding and powerlifting are very comparable to the implicit race debates that were being had 50 or 60 years ago, because there is the idea of, this inherent state. So we're all talking about the white body, or we're all talking about a very distinct male body or a very distinct female body. And it is interesting to see that when challenges arise, there is an attempt to kind of shut down shop and, protect these kind of antiquated ideas. And it's only starting to happen in, say, trans bodybuilding or trans powerlifting. But the similarities with what bodybuilders and powerlifters of color had to go through in the 50s and 60s is actually very interesting. And there's not yet enough done on kind of the trans phobia within the fitness community, especially when it comes to high profile transitions. But a lot of the, I think, methods and approaches to it will be rooted in some of the critical race work that's been done on the 1800s and the early 1900s, because there is this kind of institutional malaise, around challenges to these ideas.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much, Conor. That is really fascinating. I was also just thinking about the way that cis gym users deliberately use exercise to trigger kind of testosterone-driven shifts in the body, right? The cis body influx and the cis body influx between and towards different kinds of gendered ideals is something which we maybe don't talk about enough. But that's all been completely fascinating. Anyone who wants to follow up any of this, this film will appear on our website, abitlit.co, and underneath Conor's film, there'll be links to his blog and also to Shannon Walsh and John Fair and a few other treasures for you there. So do look at that if you'd like to follow up more of that. But thank you very much, Conor. It's been fascinating.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on. And I do apologize because I know my dog started barking like halfway through. Can't control them, so I can only apologize for them.
Mixing the world of humans and animals is one of the many things we're all about. Please give the dog a pat on the head from us.
Yes, thanks so much.
Cheers.